Well, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure for the Independent Office of Evaluation of IFAD to welcome all of you in this learning event on community-driven development. I need to especially thank you, given the weather conditions, that you made it on time to be here in Rome, and despite the fact that your children probably are at home, right, because there are no schools, exactly, or joined to the office. So we are indeed very, very happy to have this learning event about the evaluation synthesis report on a very important topic for IFAD. We have gone a long time backwards as we learn from this type of approaches to rural development. And let me start with a question, which is why is community-driven development important to IFAD and to rural development, for rural people? And according to the notes prepared by Joanna, community-driven development has played and continues to play a crucial role in IFAD's mandate and strategy. As you all know, empowering the rural poor is an important principle, which is at the heart of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development. In addition, community-driven development is an approach that works well within the context of the IFAD engagement. This evaluation synthesis shows that IFAD operations apply the community-driven development approach perform better in some criteria, such as effectiveness, gender equality and women's empowerment, and sustainability of benefits. The analysis also provides important lessons about how to strengthen this approach and which are the shortcomings of the approach that need to be addressed. But despite these achievements and the long history of engagement in community-driven development, it seems that IFAD recently has diminished its focus on this type of approach. And as Joanna Pennartz, who was the lead evaluator for this exercise, will explain later, there are some important lessons to be drawn from there. But before really getting into the discussion, let me first welcome very warmly Paul Winters, our Associate Vice President for Strategy Knowledge Department, who will provide us with some introductory remarks. Followed by his remarks, Joanna will make a brief presentation, and then we will have two panel discussions. After her presentation, Emily Singh will share his comments on the synthesis report. I think we have him connected, and as we have Benoit as well. And we have two panels comprised of very distinguished panelists. Lauren Phillips, the director at Interim of OPR, who joins us from Senegal. You also have Paolo Silvieri, Mattia, and I'm sure that we will have a very important engagement and iterations. We hope that we will have enough time for your question and answers. And so without much further ado, I would like to give the floor to Paul Winters.
Thanks. And Roberto, right?
Oh, sorry, Roberto.
That's right. I saw you starting looking around.
Yes.
All right. Well, thanks very much. I know that we were talking before about the room and it being a little awkward to have a meeting, but it's actually kind of nice because it makes it a lot more informal and we can talk informally. So to start, I wanted to tell a little story. So I was here, after I was here about 2 years, my PhD supervisor from Berkeley came, Alain de Janvry, and he was saying, oh, so, how are things at IFAD? And I was, describing, he said, IFAD invented community-driven development, and yet the World Bank got all the credit for it. And part of it you see in this study, because we did a tremendous amount of this type of approach, but you see the citations here are mostly from the World Bank and from World Bank studies of this. And it has been something that's been at the forefront of what we've done. And it is a concern potentially if it's not being done as much as it was. Now, what we ultimately want is agency. We want to make sure that those people that we're working with feel empowered. Now, that's not enough. We want much more than that. But that's part of getting to what we want, that we want them to have better opportunities. We want them to build resilience. And to do that, you need to empower them. And this is one of the things that came out of the Rural Development Report for youth, is that, yes, they need to be productive, yes, they need to be connected, but they also need agency. And so the question becomes, what's the best way to do that? And maybe there's other things. There's other ways than community-driven development. Maybe there's other approaches. And so we should do what's best, but we shouldn't forget that that's an important component of what we do. And so it's very important to have these kind of studies to make us refocus and think about that issue and how do we empower. And to think, if it's not community-driven development, then what are we doing and what are we going to do? And so we need to make sure we don't forget that and find the evidence that does help us with that. That being said, there are two interesting, sorry to preempt what you're going to say, but there's two interesting results that I think we really need to think about. The first is in fragile context, that it does seem to work better in those areas. And that does make a bit of sense. You have a fragility, you have social capital declining. And so how do you build that back up? How do you make sure people are empowered to take control of their future? And then the second area is Indigenous peoples, is that you see that it seems to work quite well. Not surprisingly, given the focus on community that you see in a lot of these populations. And so again, we need to think are we behaving in the right way in terms of our projects in these types of communities? Should we reconsider what we're doing in Latin America and parts of Asia where there's very large indigenous populations that have very high poverty rates that we work with? And so how are we going to best approach them and to work with them? So hopefully this will be part of a conversation ongoing, not just about community-driven development, but how do we ensure that as we move forward, we don't forget that in that process you need to empower people to be in charge of their futures and to think about the best way to do that along with the other objectives that we have. So with that, thanks.
Thank you. Now, Joanna, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. First of all, thank you very much, all of you, for coming despite the horrible weather. So I think it's really great to have you here. And as you see, I mean, this is, we want to see this as a final consultation and discussion on our synthesis. I mean, the purpose of this meeting is both to look at what we actually found and what lessons can we draw, but also to think about how shall we continue, as Paul said, with CDD in the future. What space do we have to promoting CDD in the modern and the IFAD 2.0 IFAD? What is the space for CDD? So that's what the reason for having this event. And I think we have, a lot of positive news and messages to share. So that's why we thought it's also good to have it before Christmas. I'm here to share the findings from the synthesis. I'm also would like to give credit to my wonderful team who's with me. There's Janet and Valentina. We have also Manuela somewhere in the back. We had, it has been a great teamwork. And of course, we had good, useful guidance and inputs also from Chan Mejai, who will speak to us in a minute. Okay, so now I need two hands. Okay, yeah, right. Okay. First of all, I mean, most of you will have seen the synthesis. The objectives of this synthesis, let me go around, has been to review the available evidence on achievement and challenges of CDD and CBD-related operations in IFAD, to identify good practices and review their relevance for future IFAD operation, and draw lessons that are relevant in the context of the Agenda 2030. So these were the objectives we had. We looked at a lot of evaluations and projects, basically starting from 1982 to 2013. So the first challenge we had for this synthesis is clarifying the concept of CDD. What does CDD mean? Because there's a lot of confusion also, participatory development, community-based development, community-led development, and community-driven development. So we had kind of, we see it as a continuum. We don't see there is CDD and non-CDD, so it's a continuum. But for the purpose of the study, we had also to define clearly what we are looking at. So we see, participatory community development is what IFAD is doing probably in 80% of the cases. I mean, there are very few projects which we have seen where there is no participation. So this is what we have very often. Then we have community-based development, which is really having the community as the focus, yeah, of participatory development, the investments focusing on communities. We have identified an interesting case model, which we also call participatory local governance, where we had projects working at the interface between government and communities, in particular in NRM, on natural resource management. And then we have the classical and really what we call pure or full CDD projects, which have a community development fund and where decision-making on the investments has been this devolved to communities. So this is, the classification you see. So you see it as a kind of continuum with participation deepening along those types. Then, of course, it's very important to see, what do we find in the portfolio? The portfolio of analysis has taken a lot of space. So I hope it is clear. So we have looked actually at all more than 1,000 projects which have been approved by IFAD. And we try to distinguish between CDD relevant. If there were really full CDD, we couldn't tell from GRIPS, but we could see, okay, they seem to have some CDD in it, and others, they don't seem to have a lot, at least not very prominent. So community empowerment is not at the core, and there are no components dedicated to community development. And within this, we had an even smaller sample, 133 projects, which had been evaluated by IOE. So that's where we could look at the performance, actually. And then within this, we selected a small sample where we thought, okay, these projects, they will provide us with important lessons. So we have been looking deeper at them. So now, very interesting. If you look at the trajectory of CDD over time, what I said, like in the beginning from 1982 to up to 2017, that's the approved number of projects. You see them peaking, around the, since 1997, 98, and then kind of going down, sloping down on 2008. So that's an important trajectory you have. What you also see, it's probably not all of them is visible, but you see the dark blue is the WCA projects. You had really a lot of CDD, at one point, and then it's kind of disappearing, almost. We had the APR, which had a constant flow of CDD. We had LUC, which had a constant flow of CDD. And then we had NEN again, we had more of NEN in the peak, and then we had them sloping down. So these were kind of interesting phenomenon which we try to understand. So we've distinguished it into 4 phases, basically. So we had the pioneering phase, where we had a few full CDD projects in few countries, and the famous ones are Mali, India, and Peru, and we have some CPMs from these times who will tell us more about the successes of this. We had then increasing the number of projects during that phase to countries in 44. And importantly, during this time, most of the supervision has been done by UNOPS. This has been for all of IFAD, but it's quite significant for CDD because it limited the opportunity for IFAD to learn from these CDD projects because they weren't quite involved in the implementation. Then we had this peak, we had the massive rollout. Then we suddenly had CDD in altogether 61 countries. It's a large number. At the same time, the projects also became bigger. We had interesting, I don't want to go into depth now, but we said that in the report, we had a new funding mechanism, the flexible lending mechanism, tried out during that time, which is, I think, relevant still for us now thinking about new funding mechanisms in IFAD 2.0. So I think these lessons need to be learned. And, we had IFAD taking over supervision, and we saw an improvement of the effectiveness and sustainability ratings. If you look at the moment, when we look at performance, we saw that improving during that period. So then we had a kind of narrowing it down during the following phase to 29 projects. We had in 2009 is another important milestones where the decision tools on for CDD. So we had IFAD taking a much more focused approach on CDD, only have it in certain circumstances. And as you see, WCA and the number of CDD projects drastically reduced. This was also in response to the global food crisis. You know, because with the food crisis, IFAD shifted attention to food security and to productivity, and somehow, you know, left aside the community, you know, level investment. So it went more into productivity increases. But I think our, you know, CPMs can also tell us more. And then we have today, you know, where CDD is still there, and we're still in the similar countries like India, Pakistan, Sudan, Yemen. We still see CDD happening in these countries. So I mean, this was very important for us to understand what has actually happened and why, you know, do we see such a trajectory here in IFAD. So if we look at effectiveness of CDD over time, I mean, in generally, as Oscar already said, CDD has performed better on effectiveness than non-CDD. You know, if you look at the evaluators, so we have 62% satisfactory ratings for CDD against 55 for non-CDD. And if you see it according to the same period, you see this is the first period, 60%, there are 60% satisfactory ratings for effectiveness, then it went up, you know, and then it did not improve further since then with the bigger project sizes, which I think is also something to think about, you know. Well, the main factors for improving effectiveness is the direct supervision, of course. There were improved linkages with local government as well, and there was some learning taking place. And I'm going to say more. I would like to highlight two of the divisions which are also present here. So, I mean, if you look at the difference between CDD and non-CDD in luck, I mean, this is really massive. There is quite a big difference, you know, that CDD has done so much better than non-CDD in luck. I mean, we try to understand what were the main reasons. I mean, we had very committed CPMs. Some are still with us today, you know. We had a learning from one project to another. In Peru, we had a series of phases and projects, you know, building on each other's experiences. And we had even, and Peru is another case, scaling up of CDD through government. So there was the link with government has been made quite successfully in Peru. And what we also found in luck, that lessons were transferred to other countries like Bolivia or Brazil. You see, there was a lot of cross-country learning. And of course, we have the supportive government policies, which I'm probably not the best one to comment on, but you know, there was a government commitment as well there. The other division where we see this the distinction, and that's why we also wanted to have Benoit with us to fill us in more, is WCA. You see, is really the performance of non-CDD projects in WCA over time is really dismal. You see, they have more unsatisfactory than satisfactory ratings in WCA. But then look at CDD. I mean, this is really quite important. You know, so there we found a strong leadership. I mean, there was a lot of reference has been made also to the division leaders. They seem to have played an important role. We have some successful projects, like from Mali, which have been scaled up, you know, and then we had also, they had two events in 2006 and 2009, so there was some learning at division level. Yeah, divisional level. There was later then a bit of a problem with the ongoing decentralization. So CDD started before decentralization policies in WCA, and then decentralization policies took off, and that led to some, you know, different agendas at local level. You know, should we empower local government or should we empower communities? So there was an inherent, I see nodding there. Yes, very good. Tension between those two. And that was, in addition to the food crisis, probably the main reasons why WCA did not continue as much with the CDD, although it was so successful in CDD. Finally, I just want you to show also the same picture for fragile situations. Let me see. So if we look at fragile situation, we also see that CDD did perform better so in fragile situations. Because it is what CDD does, it works at this institutional, level. But of course, it is quite challenging to conduct and implement in fragile situation because it requires a more adaptive approach. I mean, the situations are constantly shifting and changing. So you need to really find windows of opportunity for empowerment. It was very effective because it has, for rehabilitating infrastructure and also provided employment benefits for the poor. But then, and that's what we found is, addressing issues of fragility in a more systemic way would require longer-term engagement, which we often didn't do. Yeah? So I think fragile states, yes, but there are a few caveats to this. Of course, everyone's saying, well, the most important result from CDD is social capital, and we can confirm that. I mean, although in our small sample only, we compare the relative importance of social capital compared to others, we see it is more important. It's been frequently reported. I mean, 100% of our evaluations say social capital has been built in CDD, and also the heavy investments into formation and strengthening of local institutions has paid off. But I would like to make a bit of a caveat there. The problem is that social capital as such is often not well unpacked. It's not specified what we mean by it. There is also a problem in evaluations, of course, in measuring social capital. We had it now. Bolivia was the case. There are many interventions going on which all affect social capital, and it's difficult to claim it's only us doing it. Also, it seems there is a bit of a chicken and egg issue. So it seems that CDD works better where we have community-based organizations in place already. At the same time, it's strengthening them, you see. But it's a chicken and egg question. So what was there first? What is the cause-effect relationship there? So in order to make those claims. And I must say, across the board, there is very little evidence that actually social cohesion that has been built under a project will continue beyond the project. Because as long as money keeps flowing, of course, people are happy to work together. But what happens if the investments are paying off? So this is basically the main caveat on social capital. Targeting is another important aspect to consider. There is, and especially John Majai can say more about it in a moment. I mean, generally there was a bit mixed evidence in World Bank that CDD targeting works well in CDD project. We did not confirm it. We found it working well in IFAD, in CDD projects. Geographic targeting was good. The CDD projects were very successful in addressing the priorities of the poor, indigenous peoples, women. So all the CDD performed very well on all of this. Main reason because we use participatory poverty analysis, talking maps, and other tools. Inclusive decision making, of course, that helped the poor also to speak out in front of others. Elite capture may be more often than we hear about them. So I think that's another issue where we're not quite sensitive in reporting it. So I think it's probably happening more than we think or than we report. Right. I have a few lessons on the right side which need to be taken into consideration, though, in targeting. First, self-targeting is not sufficient in CDD. And CDD requires a critical mass of investments and sufficient time to go into depth. What happens if you have very little investment? It's likely to go skewed, go to the better offer. So the more you have and the longer you invest, the more likely you are able to reach the poor. In some cases, it makes sense to have specific funds allocated to the ultra-poor, indigenous peoples, and women. So in order to support the target, not to put it up to the community, but have them earmarked and ring-fenced for some groups. And of course, the issue of community contributions, as you all may, if they are not set in a fair way, they may actually even strengthen inequality. Now, oh, sorry, I missed efficiency. We have also efficiency. Yes, we have efficiency here. Okay, so first, that's very quickly. Efficiency, CDD projects have a bad reputation on efficiency, and we cannot confirm this. We did not find much difference in terms of IOE ratings between CDD and non-CDD, but of course you need to look closer. The effectiveness lag, so the time it takes for a project to take off, is very similar to non-CDD. Yeah? So there is not much difference between CDD and non-CDD, but of course the project duration is longer. But looking at extensions, we did not see that this was because of more extensions given to CDD projects, because they were planned to last longer. Yeah? So they took longer, but they were meant to take longer. Yeah? So we have also more supervision and implementation support missions, which make it slightly more expensive, the project. So that is probably the reason why CDD has a bad reputation in terms of efficiency, but we can't say that. If you look at the local level, though, the construction costs on infrastructure, in community development projects are much lower, because communities do the procurement, they do the supervision, they often use local contractors. So we cannot confirm this otherwise. Right. Then finally, of course, sustainability. Okay. Sustainability, yes, this is the big plus usually seen for CDD. CDD is more sustainable, although I must say, and we all know this from the RE as well, that CDD is a bit of a Achilles heel still in IFAD. So the overall performance is not the best criterion, but CDD does better than and has the potential to do much better on sustainability. So it's because of community ownership. But we also need to have local government to sustain investments. So factors for sustainability are, of course, the financial viability. We need, again, sufficient time and capacity building in order for communities to take over responsibilities. We need to have sustainable linkages with community planners and service providers, both public, private, and civil society organizations. So the same, pretty much the same, that applies also to non-CDD, but even more critical for CDD, I would say. Yeah. Okay, let me go to the conclusions from the synthesis now. So we looked in particular at we're still okay at time, yeah, CDFs, at community development funds as a key mechanism. So this is what we had in the traditional CDD, community development funds as key mechanism to empower communities, and it worked well in the context of IFAD. And I mean, John Medjai has challenged me again and again, say, why is it working better in IFAD than in World Bank? We need to find out what it is. I mean, this is the reasons we could think of. Perhaps you have more reasons. First, we had a lot of full CDD projects, and where we had CDD throughout the components, they worked better in all criteria, but in particular with regard to social capital, which we looked at, which we said. Community development funds that were fully decentralized to communities performed well, where we had strong community structures in place. So that's where we get the variation in performance. And of course, community-based initiatives were more effective in remote and marginalized areas. And we need to remember this is where we traditionally work in. So IFAD is different from World Bank in terms of who we are targeting. So we are targeting groups of people and locations that, where CDD is a better way of doing things. And this is an important reason to explain probably some of the differences. We also found that the results were better for projects that followed a programmatic approach, like in Ethiopia, we had, the pastoral development program, or had longer project duration planned from the beginning, not just being extension if we see that we can't finish, but have it from the beginning, be aware how long it takes, and then go for it. And of course, I mean, it's IFAD stuff. I must say, IFAD staff is the greatest asset the organization has, and it has done a tremendous job on CDD, and we should remember that, even though we are changing, yeah? So how valuable it is. Yeah, give a cheers to us, please. No, not finished, but give a cheers to us, yes. Okay, conclusions, more conclusions. Now we come a bit to the caveats, of course, because we are IOE. The rollout of CDD was too hasty. Yeah, so I think it was the step from going from pilots to the big rollout was done too quickly, and not enough evidence and learning throughout the organization, although it happened in some regions, but not throughout the organization. Although, and this is the big puzzle still, although CDD performance has improved over time, IFAD has lost its focus that this is actually a comparative advantage. We think that CDD remains relevant for IFAD, probably in a different way. I don't say that we need to do it the same way, but in a, as a principle and an approach, it remains relevant. because first it addresses the mainstreaming issues that are the core of our mandate: gender, food security, climate change, indigenous peoples. It is CDD is principle for local ownership is critical for improving IFAD's performance on sustainability. If we want to do something on sustainability to improve our performance, we also have to think about community ownership. And CDD, of course, is a principle as such, a value as such, that promotes effective, accountable, and transparent institution, and ensures responsive and inclusive and participatory decision-making at all levels. And this is, you know, we make a reference to SDG 16, which is not much thought about by IFAD, but there is a SDG which has precisely, and now Hisham, yeah, so that is why we have you here. The SDG 16, you know, where we are actually in it, yeah, that's what we have done throughout. So now, recommendations first. And we can discuss them further. IFAD needs to build on its comparative advantage and retake corporate ownership. That's important, the corporate ownership of CDD, not leaving it to some, you know, outdated old projects, you know, but take ownership, try to make something of it, and make it visible throughout our strategies and institutional functions. An important aspect is that we get a shared understanding what we mean by CDD, not that we have like India doing one thing, you know, it's good, it needs to be customized, but we need to have a shared understanding at least where we want to go. The expectations on CDD results must be matched with appropriate levels of resources at design. I mean, I know that this is an itchy issue, you know, but we need to factor in sufficient money and time to do CDD properly if we want to see the results which I've been pointing out. And a very concrete third recommendation, and we'll have Lauren speaking about it, is to integrate CDD-friendly funding instruments. We call them CDD-friendly funding instruments, such as flexible funding mechanisms and CDFs into IFAD's range of financial instruments. There might be others. I mean, these are from the past. So these are our recommendations. And I think the idea is now to have Janmejai's comments before we go for questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Joanna. Please join me in a round of applause. A fascinating presentation. Let us now turn to Janmejai for his comments. Janmejai, can you hear us? Because we cannot hear you.
He was there. I spoke with him.
Can you turn your mic on? Because I think the noise that we heard at the beginning was his. So probably his.
Let me try turning the video off.
All right, good.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very well. Please go ahead.
Okay, great. Great. Well, so thank you for the opportunity, and let me start, I guess, by congratulating Joanna and the team for doing this very comprehensive evaluation synthesis. I mean, when I saw the approach paper, I was always worried that could they pull off such a large array of research in such a short time and cover so many dimensions of CDD, but they've managed to do that. And actually, what I really appreciated is that the report is both balanced and it also has very good sort of useful conclusions which are relevant not just to IFAD but globally. Just as an introduction for myself, I used to be the coordinator for CDD in the World Bank for about three and a half years. Several years ago now, but I've maintained sort of a perspective, a global perspective on CDD, although now I focus mainly on Afghanistan and South Asia. I thought I'd give comments in two parts. The first part comparing the experiences, sort of comparing the findings you got for the IFAD evaluation with the experiences we've had in the World Bank, and then the second part largely in the form of suggestions for how to what to do with this research. On the first part, when I compare, so three big observations which are interesting with sort of both similarities and differences between what IFAD experienced with CDD and what the World Bank has experienced. So first of all, the evolution trajectories, or those phases that you saw in this synthesis of what's happened in IFAD, there's been a similar threefold phase evolution in the World Bank, but it's been slightly different. So the World Bank CDD began mostly as emergency pilot responses, smaller programs. Your second generation programs were trying to scale this up, trying to see if they can be better, bigger, and so on. But now what you have in the portfolio are what we call third generation CDD programs, which are essentially nationalized platforms. They're scaled up, countrywide, multi-sector. They sort of bridge that divide between government versus CDD being sort of competitors. They bridge the divide between public goods and private goods. So a lot of the earlier, if you read what our IEG did, independent evaluations in 2005, and then later the citizen engagement one, a lot of those things have transitioned out. The result of that is that while we saw similar trajectory growth in CDD programs, and then actually did see a dip in the number of projects per year, our actual lending has gone from an overall average of 2 billion a year to an overall average of 3 billion a year now. So there are less projects, but they're much bigger nationalized programs like the one I worked with, the Citizens Charter in Afghanistan, the national CDD programs in the Philippines, Myanmar, the ENDH in Morocco, you name it, there are NR in India. These are mega big programs. So that's an interesting deviation in trajectories. That being said, so this is my second point in terms of comparative behavior of the organizations. If you look just at the agriculture GP, we did see a similar trend after the food crisis in 2008 as what IFAD experienced. The agriculture GP, which used to, mind you, be called the Agriculture and Rural Development Global Practice, and now it's just agriculture, it's still the lion's share of our CDD portfolio, but the focus has shifted much more to productivity, much more to food security, climate smart agriculture, and you see in that portfolio specifically, so not the other global practices like social development or social protection, but in the agriculture GP, a fairly similar trend to what happened in IFAD. Now, what does that mean? So third observation, what does it mean for CDD's relevance today? And I think what came out of this in the recommendations that I see from Johanna and team and what we see in the World Bank is that CDD continues to be the preferred vehicle for three kinds of situations: for vulnerable places, for vulnerable people, and for vulnerable times. What do I mean by that? CDD for vulnerable places is still important because if you look at the fragility portfolio, the FCV portfolio of the World Bank, while it's maybe 10% in terms of volume, 2/3 of the FCV portfolio projects globally are CDD projects. It shows you how big a share, how dominant a share CDD is in a fragile context. And that also applies to lagging regions. It applies to areas within countries which are otherwise okay, within cities, that CDD is relevant in those vulnerable places. Same thing with vulnerable people. I think Paul Winters noted the point on Indigenous people in his introduction. That's what we see, that if you have to target very smallholder farmers in remote places, if you have to target women, you have to target ethnic minorities, youth, all of those spaces for vulnerable people the CDD approach still is the most preferred vehicle. And finally, vulnerable times, emergencies, shocks. So if the new program that's coming in Afghanistan on early warning, early finance, early action is entirely going to be run through a CDD mechanism to respond to disasters and shocks. Now, these are reflections we've had in the World Bank, that you look at vulnerable places, vulnerable people, vulnerable times, and CDD tends to be the preferred modality. I think the same will be true in IFAD, and I think that way, supporting the recommendations and given that IFAD clearly has a comparative advantage, I think it's important that trajectory be looked at, because even in the agriculture space, if you really want to reach the bottom of the pyramid, you need bottom-up approaches that will be CDD oriented. Now, second part of just my comments were reflecting on the observations and findings in the evaluation synthesis. So the first I guess these are more suggestions. The first suggestion is that I think there's a lot of material and reflections, you saw it in the presentation Joanna just made, that probably need to be made more bite-sized and put in smaller formats so that we can really have a discourse around specific themes that came out of that. Relatedly, my second point on this is that Joanna, you mentioned it, I've been hounding you, you have to look deeper in things like how did IFAD manage to get such good results on social cohesion, whereas you look at 3IE evaluation syntheses, even the one that we did in the World Bank, it's a very mixed record on stuff like this. And so if IFAD can lead the way on social cohesion, you're getting better results on targeting, that needs to be explored further, because that has global relevance on how do you do that. And finally, I just wanted to make a plug that, I think Paul Winter said that IFAD, you were the creators of CDD, but you don't get credit for it. Part of the reason is that I don't think there's enough outreach and sort of sharing of information across the development community. Perhaps the World Bank does a bit more of that, but we have a big global practice and a community of practice that's both internal and external. And I would strongly recommend that IFAD use this evaluation synthesis and do a circuit to share amongst that COP, because that organizes every year a global event, 2 or 3 regional CDD events, and I think getting the learning and experience of IFAD in those sort of events will be and those fora will be very important. Let me stop there, and happy to sort of participate in the Q&A or respond to any panel discussion comments.
Thank you very much, Janajai. That was really very insightful, and thanks for sharing your experience in the topic, as well as the World Bank perspective, which give us also a comparative analysis of where we are situated in that regard. We have time for a quick Q&A. I will take a few questions at this round before we get more deeper into our 2 forthcoming panels. And therefore, I would like, if you could kindly introduce yourself and specify to whom your question is directed, either to Joanna or Janemai. The floor is open. Yes, please. We have one there. Anybody else? 2? Anybody? Okay, we'll start with this 2.
Good morning, Ivan Kuko from the Quality Assurance Group. Thank you very much for the presentation. Quick question for Joanna. Thanks for pointing out the link between the global food crisis and the trend in CDDs. On that, have you found any evidence or any information on the relations, on the impact that CDD projects have on food security and nutrition, which is of course not the same as productivity? Thank you.
Let's go for the
I think we need the microphone pass on.
Thank you very much. Philippe Remy, I was CPM for Mali and Mauritania, and I'm CPM for Tunisia. But actually, I started in 2011, so I'm very young, so it's a bit. No, but actually, I have the feeling that if we look at the decreasing number of CDD projects, and if you look at the increasing number of value chain projects, I think there is a strong link. And maybe you didn't say it, but I feel this is one of the reasons, because now most of our projects are value chain projects. So actually value chain was actually the fashionable way of presenting our projects. You know, development is about fashion anyway. So actually we didn't talk about CDD anymore because we wanted all of us had to prepare value chain project. But actually I think there is a way of combining the two anyway, because actually you can work on CDD and at the same time support inclusion of the poor into value chains. And so there are some examples of those type of projects. For example, in Mauritania, we decided to have a value chain, not first a CDD approach, but improving the inclusion of the poor, the smallholder, in value chain. So actually it's possible to link the two. So I mean, so it was maybe a question about this combination with value chain and this yes, articulation of the two approaches.
Yes. Thank you. Let's take that. Yeah. Thank you very much for the two questions. First, on the food security. Yes, well, I can't say we have a lot of evidence because it wasn't well reported, but we do think there is a link, and because of two aspects mainly, but perhaps you may think of even more of them. First is CDD in general is very holistic. You know, it addresses poverty issues, including food security issues, in a holistic way. And because of this, I mean, it's not just one input or one type of product, but it looks also at, you know, at livelihoods more broadly. So we find that in generally, I mean, there seems to be a positive impact, although we don't have the detailed evidence that it has happened. So there is a link because of this. There is another important aspect which we had also, as Oscar already said, we had together four focus groups on, and one was on this mainstreaming themes, including food security. There is the aspect of food sovereignty, so that people can take decision on what they want to eat and what they want to produce. This is very important because it's not that we provide them with cheap corn, imported from the US, but, we want them to lose their local produce. And linked to this is, of course, again, the indigenous people, so indigenous knowledge, so how can we strengthen, from within the food security rather than shipping in, a lot of external food aid or anything like that. I mean, but as I said, the evidence is very, very weak on that, yeah. But I think that's an important link conceptually to be made as well for IFAD. The second aspect, yes, I agree. I mean, if we look at the trajectories of, number of projects, we see this. And we see also that, because we are looking, I mean, the problem, we're always constrained with the portfolio information. But what we see in the earlier types of projects, they had more of this, what we call carte blanche approach, to have this big CDD fund, which went to the communities and they decided what they do. And then later we had more and more predefined components, and components on technology development, components on productivity. So this is what what the value chain projects also do. So there was less space then for CDD, or even if you had CDD, then for CDD decision making, then you went to this this menu, choice of menu options. So do you want pumpkins or do you want corn, but nothing in between or something, something like that. Yes, but I agree, and you're right. I mean, I would see the link.
Thank you very much, Joanna. I know that in this type of events, one question leads to another, and we really want to chip into the discussion because it's becoming more interesting. Please be so kind to write your questions down, because we do have two more panels, and we would like to hear those perspectives, but your insights right now are important. So therefore, please write them down, and we will be happy to open a Q&A session after that. Very shortly on value chains, we have done a corporate level evaluation on value chains, and we have seen that indeed the governance of the value chain is extremely important for its effectiveness. And it is in the governance of value chain where these type of approaches are more suitable. Thank you. With that, I think I'll pass now the floor to Joanna to organize the two panels, and we will continue, please.
Thank you very much. As we said, we have two panels. We have one panel made of the, the old experienced, not old in terms of age, but long-term experienced CPMs who have seen CDD throughout, you know, the time, and we were especially looking at the experiences from LAC, WCA, and APR, where we had CDD very strong throughout and also performing very strongly throughout. So so we have Paolo, we have Mattia, and we have Benoit. So we expect Benoit also to come in. And the question I would like to give to you, I mean, we tried to explain why CDD has worked so well. Is there anything from your division which you would like to add? Say, why did CDD work so well in the context of your division? And yeah, so what would you say? Perhaps we start with Paolo. We have, perhaps then go to Benoit and then Mattia.
Thank you very much. Excuse me. Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you to IOE for the initiative, and congratulations, by the way, for looking at these issues and also for recovering the thematic evaluation instrument. That I should commend Oscar and his team for that. That has been a very effective learning and exchange instrument in the past, and I'm happy to know that it's back on track. What made the difference in LAC at the time? I know the Peru experience is the best known, but there has actually been methodologies developed all over the Andes area, starting from Bolivia and then moving to Peru. In a way, they coincided with the professional, personal evolution of a colleague of ours who, at some point in time, decided that it didn't make sense for IFAD to be here while the projects were so far away, and if IFAD wanted really to serve its mandate, CPMs, or project controllers, as they were called at the time, had to be in the field. And therefore he said, well, I'm going to the field. And then IFAD replied, you know, you can't go to the field because CPMs or country project controllers are based here. We're not decentralized, and our board members at the time did not want IFAD to be decentralized. Therefore, you cannot go. And the man said, you know, I will go. If you don't like it, fire me, but I'm going. So we are quite sure what would happen today, but at the time he was actually kept on board, and he was given a chance to not only think out of the box, but open a new line of work in a very different way. So the IFAD's capacity to innovate was not only substantial, but was also extreme sometimes in the in its behaviors and consequences. At the time, IFAD started with very few people, and in the 80s, what IFAD would do was basically signing checks and co-financing other agencies' projects, because we didn't have capacity to do our own. And then we developed an evaluation function and started evaluating co-financed operations, and surprise, surprise, there were no effects whatsoever on poverty reduction from our co-financing, because the projects and the agencies we co-financed did not have rural poverty reduction as their mandate or main focus. So based on that, we started developing our own operations and see how to get closer and closer to our target groups, and that's where we get to CDD. And particularly through the Peru and Bolivia experience, there were a number of instruments developed, and another major fight at the time was to convince IFAD management to accept to direct funds straight to communities, which at the time was out of question. I mean, IFAD would lend to governments for them to pass over these resources to state banks or state agencies, but to the public sector in its various capacities. And there was no question of giving money out to the public, because it would have been, at the time, the idea was, if you do that, it's like opening a bank and leaving it to anyone who passes by and taking the money and running, so that they will steal IFAD's money, it's going to be a disaster, and so on. Then finally the testing started again on the responsibility and risk of pioneer project controllers and then CPMs, and surprise, surprise again, the outcome was that these projects were more effective, they were more sustainable, they were sometimes more efficient, because they relied a lot on peer controls, on peer control mechanism and monitoring mechanisms. And they actually made a difference, because the flow of resources from IFAD to central banks and then to state banks or ministries would actually continue down, so to speak, to the community level, and that made a substantive difference in terms of correcting asymmetries in power relations also, and in income at the local level, and in terms of sustainability particularly. So the people-centered approach was prevalent in these projects. Now what we see is a more of a market-driven methodology, and IFAD is concentrating on different things, which is fine, because they are needed now. The context is different. But at the time, these spaces were open, and I'm not surprised, as Paul said, that the bank, the World Bank, took the credit for this, and others too, because that's also part of what IFAD was, a pioneer that initiated ideas and put them as public goods available to other agencies to scale them up, and to governments to scale them up. And Peru and Bolivia have been scaling up a lot. The last thing I wanted to comment on is the social capital that you touched upon, social fabric, as it's called, tejido social, as it's called in the highlands, in the Andes. Actually, IFAD won prizes in Peru in particular for its work and its contribution to the peace process after the years of Shining Path, and by showing how IFAD projects, one after the other, had been building on each other's experience and recreating a social fabric that had been destroyed. And that is something that it's very hard to measure. It would be today very hard to report upon. But then we see situations like Bolivia. I have to be careful, as there are people much more prepared on Bolivia than I am. But Bolivia, a few weeks ago, they went through a deep crisis, which was not only political but also social, and it went very close to a civil war situation, but it didn't get there. And it didn't get there for the sense of responsibility of a range of people on both sides, and also because the social fabric was allowed for those people to bridge the two sides and get over the crisis and get on with the solutions instead of confrontation. So, what is the value of that? How many lives were saved? How many resources? How many years of development that would have been lost in case of a violent confrontation? That is hard to measure, but still it's a substantial contribution. So the social fabric element I would highlight as one of the main contributions to societies by CDDs.
Thank you very much, Paolo. I think that's a very useful insight. Benoit, can we hear from you now from WCA? So why did CDD work so well in WCA, and why did it then disappear almost as a result of the food crisis?
Thank you very much. I hope you can hear me from the afternoon.
We can hear you. Okay.
Good. So, indeed, as head of West Africa Hub, I want to thank also IOE for this very good work. I have the impression that not only you bring back a topic, community development, like Philip was saying, was a fashion of the day 20 years ago and has faded out a lot in many institutions. But I was very impressed by your evaluation of 350 projects, which is probably 1/3 of the IFAD portfolio. So for West Africa, indeed, the community development was particularly well used in many projects for several reasons. And I think that's mostly because communities are very strong also in West Africa. The village identity, the group's identity are strong. There are many farm organizations, and this has helped a lot to do good projects on community development. And only when the market pressure came and that IFAD moved more into market, we slowly shift the portfolio and having more market activity nowadays. But to me, community development is still very important. I will try to say it in 3 points. First, because in Sahel in particular, we are in a kind of, say, fragile environment with weak governments. And the fact that having a community group helps them a lot to be open to a changing world. You know, for lack of schools, for lack of extension services, the point of supporting these groups allow them to have access to a proper education, whether it is on agriculture or rural finance and other aspects. That's number one. The number two is, I think, it's also a peace-building tool. Why? Because when you train women groups or youth groups, like for example in Mali, and these youth groups are meeting among villages, that build linkages among them, which bring a stronger solidarity, and that prevents as well conflict for erupting. You know, the Mali situation now is becoming worse and worse in the north and now in the center. And people doing that war are using a competition among village, among ethnic groups to do that. So I think community development is a very important element to build peace, and that should be part of IFAD future. I see that in Senegal as well, which is more peaceful country, where you can see women groups, for example, which have been created 10, 15 years ago and still continue to work together. And it's amazing the connections it creates among this group, among these women, that build so much confidence among themselves that they are ready now to move to other level of activities. And in Senegal, for example, they built what they call the interprofession, which is meaning mixing the producer, the transformer, the traders, all together in one association. And that's amazing how the move from community development to market linkage was done really in a seamless way, very easily. So I appreciate this aspect of solidarity among people and bringing them as well in market activities. So CDD can lead a lot to the business aspect, and I think it's important. To conclude, I think we have to use that also more and more in the future about the aspect of citizen engagement. Because indeed in IFAD, by being too much these last years on markets or sometimes on enterprise and infrastructures, being more in the hand of the governments, and you know the tensions can be sometimes between governments and communities, especially in other parts of the world. Well, Latin America was mentioned, but I remember cases in Nepal, you know, when during the Maoist guerrilla, the community development activities of IFAD helped to keep many villages in place and solid. So I would say that citizen engagement is coming more and more now, and we have to use these groups, this farmer organization or indigenous people organization as well, to do the citizen engagement. So I think that's all in a nutshell, and not to be too long. So thank you again for doing that study on community development. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benoit. I think that's very useful. It also shows that there is a slightly different motivation and context, you know, for CDD, which we all have to consider, and also for flagging the aspect of citizens' engagement, which indeed is very important. We will discuss that in a moment when we move to the last panel. But let us hear first from Mattia about India. We haven't spoken about India, and it presents a different case of CDD, but very important case of CDD.
Thank you, Joanna, and good morning, everybody. I also join my colleagues to praise IOE. This is an excellent piece of job. It was great to put back on the agenda the CDD model and to start thinking why we almost forgot about it, or we reduce emphasis on it. Speaking last, I may face the risk to repeat what was said before, so I'll try to say something new. And in fact, I was ready to speak about India, but based on what was said, also I was thinking about something else. But first of all, why in Asia also CDD was pretty popular. And in this particular case, Philippe is right, development is about fashion, but I would not refer to that as a fashion. It was, in Asia, I think we had a kind of logical consequence of a strong commitment on IFAD's mandate on poverty, reaching out to the poorest areas, reaching out to the most marginalized communities. In Asia, it was particularly strong, like in Latin America. Probably it was also easier to do that. But in Asia, we received so many feedbacks by governments. This is IFAD. This is a project that can only be taken by IFAD. This is only IFAD who is willing to take some risk and even trying to put some innovation. I think this is part of our history that we should not forget, and in fact, we should be, I would say, a bit proud of. So in this context, it's natural, of course, should not surprise that CDD may be more effective when dealing with indigenous peoples or other communities. Because in those areas, government relationship with communities are not smooth. So unless you are able to devise a system, an institutional mechanism where you have really strong element of ownership leading to genuine elements of empowerment, then your project will fail. But of course, we also had the strong element of commitment by the staff. I think we were a very kind of united division in this regard. And we were sharing quite a bit of information also. At the time, we were not talking about South-South cooperation, but we had concrete examples of sharing ideas and sharing models. I would say something about India, but I was thinking more about Vietnam, because in Vietnam we had a major innovation. Why are you nodding on Vietnam? Do you know Vietnam? Yes. Ah, okay, sorry. No, because it would have been interesting. Because it's in Vietnam, we had a number of situations which were favorable, that we were operating in Tuy Quang province, which was 3.5 hours drive from Hanoi. And we introduced this commune development board. In Vietnam, the administrative line is central government, province, district, commune, and village. And this commune development board became so effective and efficient in convincing central government that by implementing small-scale infrastructure through these institutions, they would save a lot of money. we had evidence that the investment cost could be cut by 50% and recurrent cost by 80%, for the simple reasons that being able to transfer financial authority to this commune, after, of course, a serious job of capacity building and administrative procedures being established, the communities would take it on, deciding what they could do, and with a significant broad range of choices, because very often we make the mistake that we say, yeah, you do it, but you can do only A or B, so don't have A. And of course, as a consequence, taking full responsibilities for the maintenance of these schemes. That was a kind of revolution, because Vietnam, a socialist country, top-down planning, everything decided from the top. And plenty of evidence that very good capacity to build infrastructure, but very poor capacity to maintain, and also the burden on fiscal resources, that was quite. But the most important thing, because now we also need to scale up, no? It was the fact that because of an endogenous process where local government would take the merit of it, and in fact we were encouraging. We didn't want to put our hat on this exercise. We didn't want to put the flag, but just we facilitate a process where local government wanted to share the results to the central government. Central government took it on board, and they started the nationwide programs covering 1,700 poorest communes. And eventually, the following project, we did a step further. We introduced at the village level, Village Development Board. So these are things that are, because one thing that it looks more or less similar between CDD and non-CDD was the parameter of efficiency. Now, if we had to focus on the efficiency of public expenditure, I would say for this kind of, because also CDD has a range of products inside, but for looking at the just efficiency on public expenditure, advantages would be very evident. So this is something I wanted to say. Another point, because I have too many things to say, and so I hope there will be some more questions to allow me some more, is related to the civic engagement, what Benoit mentioned, and the fact that one of the reasons probably that we have reduced emphasis on CDD was because of the emergence of a different kind of projects. We can say from people-centered projects to market-centered projects. The world has changed. IFAD has also changed. And the way we are designing our programs is completely different. In those days, there was a serious effort for a socio-economic assessment, also a livelihood assessment of local communities, and then trying to see what kind of project activities could fit and could respond to these needs. Now, of course, the design starts from what is more feasible and financially rewarding on the market, sometimes with the private sector coming in right at the beginning, and then somehow seeing how people would fit into these value chain opportunities. Of course, I'm simplifying. But I think we should take the challenge to see how, and I like what Philip said, to see how these two things can be combined. But we need to work hard, and we need to do it ourselves, and then we need to document more. Final point I wanted to say, pity Paul is not here, but when he referred to the fact that he had to listen to his own supervisor to tell him that if I'd invented the CDD and then the World Bank took credit for it, well, first of all, I would have told him we knew it also. There was no need to wait for your supervisor coming here. But also the fact that the World Bank, and I hope Mr. Singh will not take it personally, but the fact that the World Bank took credit for it was also because in those days we didn't have authorization to carry out supervision directly. So we were relying on cooperating institutions. And of course, we were doing a very poor job in terms of documenting and even selling what we were doing. So I think this is something that we can be aware of, but I think if we move forward, we need to also think hard about how to document and share this information. That's all. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Before going to our last panel, because you already gave them some things to comment on and think about, we have time just to take two questions. There was one from Sarah here and another one. Okay, so I just give the mic.
Yes, sorry, and I wanted to make this remark before, but then the comments, especially from Paolo and Mattia, gave me this. Now, I'm sorry, I was not here from the beginning, and I didn't talk to Paul, so I don't know what is his point of view. So it's going to be Sarah's point of view, not even director of RIA. It seems to me, and I may be wrong, because I was not here at IFAD for a long time, so I didn't know what was going on, that really IFAD has pioneered not really the CDD, which was a project design that was born maybe from the literature. I even don't know, sorry, I apologize. I don't know the story of the CDD. But I think that really IFAD has pioneered the application of the CDD to the agriculture sector, and the producer, what somebody called what you call the value chain projects that we are developing now, and the typology and the design of the value chain project reflect, even though if they're market-based, the design of the CDD. And I want to think of the projects like the PPAP, the PSSA in Peru, where Plan de Negocios, are more or less the application of the CDD to the agriculture, to the new characteristic and the new challenge of the agriculture sector. And we proved in the impact assessment, IFAD 10 impact assessment report, that the strong advantage of IFAD in terms of, we prove it with numbers, in terms of percentage point impact on production and market access, are the strongest for the projects that have a strong component of value chain. But really, for me, they are the natural evolution of the CDD when country grows. And it is not of a surprise that in countries like the Solomon Islands, you still have two components, CDD and producer organization, while in neighborhood countries like Papua New Guinea, which is a different stage of development, in the Solomon Islands, you have the BPAP type of projects. And it's not of a surprise, like Paolo said, that projects, in the case of Peru, are working so well, also in Latin America in general. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Nicola. Can you hear me? Nicola Drago, and I'm happy to be a value chain consultant in a CDD seminar today. And the first thing, I'd like to congratulate for the very well-defined presentation, very interesting learning opportunity today for me. I'd like to suggest a couple of things linking on with Mattia's words and with Oscar's words. I think there shouldn't be a dichotomy between value chains and CDD. I don't think it's a good idea. And I think there are two entry points for IFAD and for all the other organizations. Value chains are very much investments, not only vision and strategy and policies, it's also investment. So investment planning can be done also at local level. And I think it's one of the entry points to link the two aspects. So when communities are involved in local investment planning, as IFAD does, it's one way to enter into the value chain issues. And the second point is that, in my opinion, having local institutions or local power groups willing to accept to sit down with community members, the second step is a governance issue also, because otherwise the decisions are not taken by the community but by strong power groups. So I wouldn't find a dichotomy, investments and the governance issue that was raised. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think these were more comments than questions. So shall we move over to the other side? We have Lauren, Roberto and Hisham. As a group, I think there was already that issue of citizens' engagement coming up. We have also, Hisham is working on a paper for the board, or has been hopefully approved or whatever, or well done, on stakeholder feedback. And we have also Lauren, who is involved with the reform team in IFAD on the new funding instruments. And there would be also the question on how do we CDFs or, you know, flexible lending kind of instruments fitting into this. So these are the kind of three issues which have been cropping up, and I would like the panel to discuss them. Do you want to take them one by one? Yeah, you start, Lauren.
Yes, thank you very much. I regret to say I might not stick as closely to brief as Joanna wishes me to, but I hope in any case it will be good reflection. I wanted to compliment you and your team on this synthesis evaluation. I think it's really focused on learning. It is, the recommendations are very, very useful and timely, and I think it has a wealth of information and evidence, and I really enjoyed reading it. I wanted to pick up on some of the discussion that was happening about trends, or fashions as they were being called. I mean, I think, you know, development, it has pendulum shifts, and so does the world. But if I could try to say a bit more broadly, what I think has happened is that, you know, I'm at the moment leading the division that's called Operational Policy and Results, right? It's not called Operational Policy and Learning. And I think that in social science in general, and in development, and in IFAD, everybody moved much more towards quantifiable findings. And I think that this move towards quantifying impact, quantifying outcomes, can lead us away from things that are more difficult to measure, but are important. And I think that social capital and the CDD model might have suffered from this general trend. So in social science, social capital was written by two important social scientists in the early 1990s, Robert Putnam and Bob Leonardi, who worked in Italy and in the United States. And those studies are brilliant, and we should go back and read them, but they're not quantified, right? They are very deep community research models, which are convincing and have logic, but are not quantified. Okay, so I think when we moved from having approaches which we knew through telling stories and listening to our colleagues that were working, but we couldn't necessarily quantify what was happening, to a world where we had a crisis, both a financial crisis and a food crisis, and where governments also became more sophisticated in their use of evidence to drive decision-making, because they became richer, to pick up on Sarah's point, more developed. And IFAD became a bigger player as well, not a niche player. I mean, I'm always struck by something that Lisandro said once, which is that we are the largest investor in agriculture in a lot of the countries in West and Central Africa now. So we're not a niche player that can do small investments. We are a major development actor in the ag sector in a lot of countries. And governments' expectations of the value that they get out of borrowing, because this is also an important evolution, on more expensive terms in a lot of cases, have changed. But I don't think that means that it's the end of the model. And it doesn't mean that we have to say, let's go back in time, or even that we have to try to blend necessarily market interventions and CDD interventions, but rather that we have an obligation to try to make a good evidence base of why this model works, using as much as possible quantifiable evidence, and then trying to use qualitative evidence to complement in convincing ways. Because qualitative evidence is useful too, but we have to have it be systematized or systematic. So I have some suggestions about this. It was interesting to hear our colleague from the World Bank saying that they do more value but fewer projects, right? But the approach actually sounds quite different. I don't know, right? But using government as platforms is slightly different, as Mattia explained, than using communities. But so what do I think we have to do? IFAD 12, or IFAD at the moment, is listening to what IOE is telling us about our continuing lag on sustainability and effectiveness and efficiency of projects. And I think that we should look and see. Let's test. If these projects are more efficient, if we can say that they disperse more quickly or that they have lower cost per beneficiary, we need to capture it, and we need to know, and we need to try to convince people that that's the case. If they're more sustainable, and we can show that they're more sustainable through ex post evaluations or through looking at benefits over time, we should also demonstrate that, and we should use it as an argument to take back these approaches and see how they work. I didn't see it in your presentation, but I noticed in the report you said that the disbursements were slower, actually. And there has been a strong emphasis on disbursement as an indicator of project effectiveness, both from the World Bank and from IFAD. So we have to look carefully at the data and understand whether or not we can make a good argument about the efficiency of projects in this case. Then, secondly, I think it's not just to convince IFAD that we need to do this, but we need to convince governments that we should do this too. I was at the APR regional retreat in South Korea a couple of weeks ago, and we were talking about mainstreaming themes, and there was a great appreciation from the teams of the importance of these issues, but I was very struck by a number of people saying, what the governments want to know is what is the quantifiable economic benefit of investing in women and youth and marginalized communities. They know that they exist, that there is an economic rationale for doing this kind of work in nutrition. You know, you get better human development and better GDP growth if you have more healthy populations. But we have an obligation to quantify this, to convince governments to borrow, to do approaches which focus on mainstreaming and community development, I think. And third, I think that this suggestion in the paper about focusing on fragility is a really good one, because it is part of that special program on fragility that we presented to the board last year, the fact that IFAD has an advantage on working from a community basis in fragile situations. I think, though, that even in fragile situations, it shouldn't be no-regret investments. We should know that it's going to lead to sustainable benefits. And so we still have to do the same work on quantifying and explaining the benefits and all of those things. And I think that if there's an answer to the question you posed at the beginning to the World Bank colleague about why did it work better at IFAD than at the World Bank, the answer is because he had, I forget, Jamajai said there were 3 reasons why it works: vulnerable places, vulnerable people, and vulnerable times. IFAD's entire purpose has been on vulnerable people. So, of course, if it worked better here, it's because we were always focused more on vulnerable people. And so we should continue to emphasize that. But that doesn't take us away from the obligation of doing aid in an efficient manner, effective manner, getting good results. Thank you.
Thank you, Lauren. Let me start from 2 points that actually you picked in your intervention, Lauren. You said that in WCA, but also I would say in ESA, we are a major player in the agricultural sector. And if I see now the kind of projects that we are working on, there is a lot of emphasis on infrastructure. And actually, I'm fearing that this emphasis on infrastructure will decrease our value added as an institution compared to the World Bank. We are bigger. We have to disburse faster, and we need to have results in a shortened time frame. Now the projects are maximally lasting 5 years. And if I see now with the new hat of procurement, the capacity that we have the World Bank in dealing with infrastructure compared to IFAD, there is no comparison. There is really no comparison. They have systems, they have capacity, they have knowledge how to do it. We don't. And I fear that in few years, giving the bread that IFAD is going to become larger and bigger to exist as an institution will decrease our value added, and we can become a branch of the World Bank because they can do better than us in infrastructural development. Yet the request for public goods in the rural areas is still very high. And I think that what we can learn from the evaluation is that we can learn from the CDD type approach, actually to see how to develop models and systems to develop to promote infrastructure development, which is actually listening and responding to the needs of the rural poor. Actually, first of all, I would like to congratulate the evaluation scientists because it was really excellent. I really enjoyed reading, and thanks to the whole team for the work. The point is that what we can learn from the CDD type approach is that we need to have different systems to develop and to deliver infrastructural development. Systems that are linked to local governance, which in the past we didn't have. When you said that when we started with the CDD, decentralization process was still at the beginning. Now in most of our countries, our client countries, the decentralization is actually occurring. But it's still a long way to respond to the needs of the rural people, and there are still systems to be developed to actually to have a participatory local governance. Philippe said that we are doing something in Madagascar, in Mauritania, and that I know also that there are some examples on more, I would say, delivering of private goods, like in Madagascar with the Fonds de Développement Agricole. But the point is that how to actually have local participatory governance, communities involved in the delivering of in actually orienting the public sector in the kind of infrastructure to be developed. Can be on local irrigation schemes, can be on feeder roads. It can be actually, it should be more and more on green type of investments. We are still struggling on how to actually put ourselves in a situation whereby there are mini grids being developed, and we need to have models and systems and communities capable to be part of the development of the mini grid systems, and actually be capable to be in the maintenance systems of these schemes. And all this, I think, is a new venture for IFAD. My fear is, I would say, because I'm just taking from one of your recommendations at the very end, is that it's not a question of developing funds, because the systems are already in place. There are public systems. The question is how to strengthen public systems to be capable to actually respond to the needs of the rural poor. And this is something that we can work a lot on. And just to give you one point, I mean, if I see, for example, coming back to the case of Mauritania, I was working with Philippe in the development of the COSOP, and a few years ago when I was an procurement officer. And at that time, we were discussing and debating about the institutionalizations of funds available at the level of the communities. These funds are still, by and large, products of projects, and when the projects are ending, the sustainability dissolves, goes away. We are now have systems in some countries whereby we can the flow of funds can be developed within the public structures, but we need to pump money into these systems, and secondly, to have systems of communities capable to have an impact on the decision-making process, and in some cases be capable actually and responsible for the implementation of this scheme. So I think that just to complete my intervention, there is scope for CDD type, not the old ones, the previous ones, kind of investment in the public goods delivery, and given the fact that we have decentralization schemes ongoing, and the municipalities, districts, communes are now legal capacity to deliver the public goods. I think we can put ourselves into that stream and actually avoid to mirror I would say in a lower scale what World Bank does better than us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, and I want to join everyone else in congratulating IOE on the excellent quality of this evaluation. In addition, I also want to congratulate you on the process. I think you had a very inclusive and consultative process for, let's say, getting everyone's ideas and bringing them to bear in this evaluation. I had the pleasure of coming to a couple of these meetings, and they were challenging conversations, but they were very enjoyable and well-run meetings. So I'd like to start with that. You mentioned you were giving us Christmas presents with the good news that's coming from this evaluation. So I think we would like to reciprocate. And so our Christmas present to you is the stakeholder feedback framework, which was just approved by the board 2 days ago. And thank you. Yes, blood, sweat, and tears. It's been a long and difficult journey. So yeah, I think the stakeholder feedback framework is an important part of the response, not only to addressing issues and concerns you raise in CDD, but generally on topics of empowerment and social accountability. So what the framework aims to do is basically articulate citizen engagement, as Benoit was saying, citizen feedback, empowerment, social accountability all together into a coherent vision for the organization of how to improve its work in this area. But in addition, it also provides a theory of change, guiding principles, specific objectives that the organization intends to pursue in the implementation of the framework, and also a very crisp and sharp implementation plan which contains a number of targets, many of which have to be achieved pretty soon. So it's an ambitious framework. So yeah, we, as part of the process, and in a way, I was thinking, would it have been better if we had, prepared the framework after your evaluation, or I mean, I think that we are converging on so many levels. I mean, the analysis that fed into the framework and the analysis that is in your evaluation. So maybe, hopefully, since you're coming probably to the board and evaluation committee after we've taken this document to the board, then it can help to reinforce let's say, the implementation of the framework and attention to it. So yeah, we've been doing a lot of good work, people-centered development, participatory development, CDD, and we've tried to farmers organizations, Indigenous People Forum. There have been several modalities and mechanisms that IFAD has been using to push the empowerment agenda. We've tried to build on those, but also raise the bar further, and so making sure that IFAD, country directors, country teams become more strategic, systematic, and proactive in promoting these agendas at the country level, but also making sure that we monitor the effectiveness of initiatives that we implement more closely, and ensuring their success. The executive board welcomed this paper, I mean, with enormous support and praise. Lots of questions, but the endorsement was resounding. Now, one of the interesting things they said was, this is very important, IFAD needs to put a lot of attention into it, and we need to allocate additional resources to it. And this is a very important part of that conversation, which I want to mention because I see under the recommendations that you have put under the executive summary of this synthesis evaluation is dedicating more resources to this work. So what we have committed to the board is to conduct a serious cost analysis over the coming year and come back to the board, so a cost analysis of what is required to implement the framework properly, to come back to the board in December in the context of the budget document and basically lay out what we believe are the additional requirements, because there will be additional resource requirements to implement this framework. The good thing is that, around the board you have the Italian chair, who is also chair of the audit committee, and he actually took that point up in the board and said we will be looking forward to it. So I think there's a seriousness in the board about, looking at what will be the additional requirements and being supportive of them. So I think this bodes very well for this framework. It is ambitious, but I think that we will get additional resources to implement it and hopefully respond to many of the concerns and recommendations that your evaluation synthesis has raised.
Thank you very much to our three panelists. Before opening for questions to any of the panelists you may have, yes, I want to, that's what I was wondering. Yes, Benoit wanted to say something, and also would want to ask Janmejai if you have any response, because you were mentioned several times, if you want to add something. First Benoit and then Janmejai. No, sorry. Mike. Yes. Mike?
Can you hear me?
Now we hear, yeah.
All right. So I wanted to make a point about the country directors, which we used to call the country program managers, and to say that sometimes many of them are not so keen to discuss particular issues with governments, especially when it comes to community development or farmer organization or this type of civil society group. And I think IFAD as an institution should also encourage its staff to go deep in these matters and not to be afraid, because actually it's a preconception that government would not agree with such activities. Many governments are open to work with a community development organization, with a farmer organization, indigenous people, etc. It's just a matter of connecting people. And this is where IFAD is the added value. We have so many examples where we manage tough governments to discuss with these organizations and works hand in hand. So this is a plea that our management could encourage the field staff to do so. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Benoit. John Majai, do you have any response or reaction to what has been said, in reference to your very short?
Hi, Joanna. So I guess, a lot of, comments did come through, but I wanted to make 2-3 just observations in general. So one on this point of niches and where I think you'd have to look at CDs. So like I made those 3 points about vulnerable places, times, and people. The other side to this, in terms of just this dichotomy between the value chain work and CDD, what we are seeing in the agricultural practice in this World Bank is that right now, if you had to, if you think of where you're headed on the agricultural frontier, there's 2 things which are driving almost a revert back to CDD there. The first is that increasingly you're seeing that this shift towards pure value chain, productivity-oriented work is missing out the most poor, vulnerable. Now, it's tricky. I know the point was made about quantifiable economic benefits to get to those most vulnerable people, but often, at least from a political standpoint, it's less that, it's actually the political imperative to reach those that we find with our counterparts is what pushes the agenda. They're like, we have to reach these, if there's farmer suicides or whatever happening, we have to reach them. And I think that recognition has caused has caused a resurgence. Secondly, I think, if you think of the whole climate smart agriculture, agriculture has become to climate change what energy was to climate change a decade ago, right? So if you see that momentum shift in terms of almost everything in the climate change agenda now, heavily looking at water conservation, looking at adaptation, looking at shifting to local produce, less industrialized farming, that again is creating a momentum shift within our work. So I just wanted to flag those. I think the point that was made about efficiency and disbursement, so that's an interesting difference. CDD projects are by far the fastest dispersing in the bank. So that's an interesting difference with IFAD, because we disperse much more heavily, and hence efficiency ratings have never been that much of a problem on our side. It's a different thing, however, to say that you do need much more evidence on economic returns, on economic evaluations of impact. I think that point is well taken. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much, John Majai. So now we still have time for like up to 3 questions. Is Philippe? Let me just see. Is any more? There is. Yes. Okay.
Thank you.
Okay, let's start with those 2.
Okay. No, actually,
you want to say?
Actually, I was thinking about the mainstreaming themes. Actually, because actually, of course, maybe introducing these themes could lead us to go back to some of what we did in Cdd. And I was thinking that those themes. Sorry, it's difficult for French people. It's difficult to. I think maybe are a bit reductive, because actually they are all individual. It's climate change, it's youth, women, but actually why don't we think about a new theme, which would be collective action? And so it would introduce in all our activity, in all our projects, a sort of collective approach of what we do. Because actually CDD is about collective action. It's collective action at local level. It can be, and this, if we had a new theme, I don't know if we could propose that to the board, but a new theme on collective action. So we would have to think about that, about introducing how to support people, how to support group of people, or how to support, yes, this type of approach, bottom-up approach, and so on in all our activities. Because I don't think it's only linked to fragile situation. Actually, it's not. Of course, in fragile situation, it's very useful. But actually, collective action is useful everywhere. Even if you go in a better off part of the world, a better off region. So I think I don't know. It's from the beginning, with those four themes, I think we are missing one. We are missing the collective approach of what we do and what is very important to do in all what we do.
There was one more question there.
Yeah, thank you. I'm Sébastien from ECG. I'm working on climate change issues. I would want to highlight that, in fact, in the recent years, we have had in the portfolio, projects that could link value chains and also community-driven development. For example, in Niger, I have in mind the PRODAF project there, and with its so-called, well, it's all about words, of course, but with its so-called production basin approach. In fact, in this project, there are a lot of community-driven processes focusing on natural resource management and also taking into account of climate change issues. And another focus is the strong connection of local producers, often organized in farmer organization, of course, to the market, to build local value chains and to provide agricultural products to medium and little-sized cities. And these cities, in this kind of cities in Western Africa, are more numerous than a decade or 20 years ago. So it's really a good example of this kind of projects having invested at the same time in a value chain approach and community-driven development, focusing mainly on climate and environmental issues.
Thank you. Can we give the mic back to Lauren, and then Hisham want to say that, and Mattia, and then we stop there, and Oscar.
Sorry, I just wanted to come back on 2 points. I mean, the first on the politics, right? Because there's an argument here about politics and whether or not governments want to work on empowering communities or not, but I think this depends a lot on the context, right? I got in trouble. I joined IFAD 5 years ago this month, and my first piece I ever wrote was trying to argue that you could only make advancements where you had political support for community-based approaches, and I was told that I shouldn't talk about those things as a civil servant in IFAD, so I say it as myself rather than as IFAD, but I think that there is an issue on looking for the positive links between where governments are interested in these methods and not, so Benoit's point and others. The other thing is on collective action. This is another fashion that's gone out of fashion, I have to say, right? The Tories just won an 80-seat majority in the British Parliament this morning, no? So, along with quantification, something else that happened, and it's driven by markets, is individualism. And we talk about women's empowerment, youth empowerment. We don't talk about community empowerment. And I like the idea very much, but I'm not sure. Those issues were also strongly driven by donors and the people that sit on our board that raise their hand and ask about women and ask about nutrition. But I haven't heard any of them asking about collective empowerment. So, yes, I think it's a great idea. Maybe we can try and push it. We can put, we can talk to the French. Maybe they will push for this. I don't think the Brits and the Americans will push for it. I'm going to get myself in trouble here, but I'm speaking as myself. But in any case, they're interesting reflections to think about the economic and political incentives for advancing these kinds of methods.
Yeah, I just wanted to quickly reinforce the point made by Benoit about the importance of country teams and directors engaging in these issues. and the receptiveness of governments to following through on them. We have the example recently from the Cameroon COSOP, which was quoted in the, actually is quoted in the stakeholder feedback framework. It's an excellent example where, well, now in all our country strategies, we have to have a section that reflects commitments to citizen engagement and transparency. So when preparing the COSOP, Bernard, CPM at the time for Cameroon, organized a two-day workshop and had some subgroups. One of them was on citizen engagement and transparency. And he had also invited members of civil society, farmers' organizations, and this also speaks to the need for inclusiveness in these processes. But he said one of the proposals that they had put at the start of the discussion was for community monitoring of project activities and engaging communities in giving feedback on their satisfaction on their project interventions. So he said the initial reaction of government was, no, why do we want to do that? Having people criticize us all the time, you know, that's, no. So they were dismissive. However, kudos to Bernard, he continued, pursued. So over the course of this workshop, he tried to convince them of the benefits of this approach and how this would add value to the various interventions supported by the country program. And by the end of this COSOP workshop, the government had completely switched its view on this and became very wholeheartedly supportive. And you look at the Cameroon COSOP has an annex of about 12 pages, or sorry, an appendix of about 12 pages, which goes into a lot of detail about how to promote citizen engagement and transparency throughout the country program. So, big shift in mindset. You know, with the effort and dedication, you can change the mind. So.
Thank you very much. We have comment from Mattia. Last. Oh, sorry. Oh, Roberto. Okay.
Thank you, Mattia. Not just one point. I think it's very important to make clear the kind of approach that we can have with CDD in the delivery of public goods, rather what we can do with the value chain inclusive approaches for private goods. This is completely different. When we're speaking about private goods, like agricultural-related private goods, we need to switch into enticing the farmers' organizations, interest groups into having a say in the way resources are allocated and in the management of that resources. When we are speaking about public goods, there is actually a good for the whole community, and therefore the community had to shift into the decision-making processes. What CDD was doing mainly that, and actually in the report it's written that was some confusion on whether we have to deliver public or private goods. I think that the whole issue of stream of CDD needs to be revamped in the context of infrastructural development, green energy types of investments, and how to enforce the communities to have leverage and power. Then on the other stream, it's the whole work on value chain, and we have to think how actually this can be interlinked, but I would say separate somehow on the work on CDD. I want just to have this clarification.
Thank you. I mean, just want to say that in Peru and in India, we also had private goods being, allocated through CDD. Mattia, and then last quick is Fabrizio, is it? Yes, Fabrizio, and then we have to wrap up. Yeah.
3 quick feedback, one to Philippe, one to Laurent, and one to Hichem. Philippe, there was an associate vice president in the past who was repeating, mind you what you are asking for because you may get it. So if you want to have an additional mainstreaming teams, then you'll have to live with that. I would say no need to have a mainstreaming things. Just go it. Just go for it. Just with that idea. Also because I think we need to recover a little bit of the innovation spirit. I would say that in recent times this pleasure to throw new ideas into our work perhaps has been a little bit reduced. However, Laurent, getting political... Good. Getting the government on board, getting political support. Thinking about that example in Vietnam, I have a beautiful anecdote to say that when we were celebrating this achievement with the national program being scaled up and so on, Then we had a chat with the provincial secretary, who was also the party secretary, who was a brilliant guy. And so I was asking him, but tell me, all this process, because it was a process of a couple of years, what were the stumbling blocks? Why? Because after all, now you have a lot of credit, you are famous, da. And he said, Mattia, what a stupid question. The stumbling block was simply that nobody likes to lose power. Introducing a CDD is losing power for government. It's a matter of handing over responsibilities to communities to manage resources on their own, as simple as that. So when we think about how to be effective in getting government on board, and this is of course something that all our country directors should be encouraged to, let's be simply aware of that, this is something that only if we are able to build up a win-win case where also the credit is given to local governments and local actors, the decision makers, then we won't be able to achieve it. And then to Isham, I'm so pleased that you got it through. I remember the very first meeting that we had when we were scouting for ideas, and I think I treated you badly. But perhaps we'll share that with friends later on. And I'm even more pleased about the call that you got for more resources and the fact that you got it. But the most important resource that we need is time. It's not money. And I think the real dilemma, the real challenge is at the moment where we are supposed to deliver quickly, and then we believe that this instrument is important, but we really need to go back and fight the old battles like the flexible lending mechanism, which was giving us enough time to start with a serious work of building local capacities, local institutions, or strengthening existing ones, because without these enabling conditions, no matter what we talk about CDD, it will not work. Thank you.
Quickly, Fabrizio, and then Oscar.
Thank you very, very briefly, and thank you for this excellent event. I think it's always great to be able to talk about development and break a little bit from discussions on delivery, commitments, and so forth. So I stepped out, unfortunately, for 30 minutes. Sorry for that, and I hope I'm not touching upon an issue that has already been mentioned, perhaps during those 30 minutes. But I was thinking about the changing nature of the rural landscape, in many countries, particularly in Asia. Of course, if we look at the past 20 years, enormous changes have happened. And if you look at the CDD, which initially was supposed to be a way of managing the relationship between the state and the local communities, in a way, finding innovative ways for doing that, and inserting communities in the process of development, and you compare it to what is happening today in many rural landscapes in Asia, you actually have a new actor coming in, which is the private sector. And so my question is really, how do we deal with this new actor, which can have a really tremendous influence on the development of communities? And here we need to distinguish, because there are some private actors that are perhaps just there to develop their own business in a narrow sense, but there is also a number of private actors that are actually coming in with social commitments with the communities. So what role can an organization like IFAD have in terms of forging more sustainable relationships between communities and these this type of private actors?
Well, thank you very much to all of you. We are really delighted for your participation in this learning event. I think we have shared lessons emerging from a very important approach in IFAD, and it was good to recover its strengths, its areas for improvement, and also the evolution of the concept of CDD. As Paul Winters said very well at the beginning, it is important to strengthen the agency, right, of rural communities, and therefore this approach is still very valid. As you know, this was a synthesis report, therefore based on existing evaluative evidence. We have gone back a long time ago, and we have identified a quite important number of evaluations conducted and so on. But at the same time, it has its limitations in terms of what we could find from that evidence, and that really points into the future directions, where we need more evidence, more in-depth analysis, and that is exactly one of the advantages of this type of synthesis that provides a learning opportunity and challenges to keep on digging deeper to find better answers. Additionally, these learning events for us are very important in terms of engagement because we want to see how the house, how the fund, how IFAD takes it forward. It has provided 3 recommendations, but the richness of this debate shows that there are many aspects to be considered in the implementation of a CDD approach as we move forward. And I want to thank you all very much for your contributions into pointing into those directions. There are very important lessons, not only in terms of approaches, but really on how to combine with the priorities of a value chain development approach with the emerging players in the field, and the importance role of local governments in implementing our projects. Lastly, I would like to thank the team that has worked on this synthesis, particularly for their insightful report and participatory approach. I want to thank our guests who really contributed with their experience and approaches, including remotely, our attendees through webcasts, who are many, and to all of you and our external attendees, which includes students from Bologna University, and to the IOE team that has made this event possible. Have a wonderful day and an excellent weekend. Thank you very much.
Very good. Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Use this stakeholder engagement, not just for monitoring, but also for evaluation.
Sure.
Right?
Definitely.
Yeah.
Okay.
I'm sure that there is room for
Yeah, we also made reference to how you involve stakeholders during the process. For CDD workshops that you have at country level. So definitely it's there. We'll make sure it's
But I said, actually,